opening this up to the audience, I would like to say that I actually think there is more evidence of the United States being involved in this surreptitiously. For one thing, Zeeshan mentioned the National Endowment of Democracy, and there, according to analyst Eva Gollinger, this organization funded the Santa Cruz Civic Committee and its youth union, which are the fascists that from the Santa Cruz area that Camacho's from for many years. And there's evidence that U.S. aid provided $84 million to Bolivian opposition groups over the years. I'd like to mention the fact that a number of the Bolivian military were trained in the U.S. School of the Americas, including Williams Kaliman, who is the general who suggested that Evo Morales leave the country. And it must be noted that his democratically elected presidency was not scheduled to end until January 21st, and this happened in November. So these are points. Among other things, OAS, the Organization of American States, which released the big report of fraud with absolutely no evidence to sustain it, is 60% funded by the United States, and that the Center for Economic Policy and Research in Washington did the most detailed statistical analysis establishing that there was no evidence in the OAS report and showing a tremendous amount of evidence that, in fact, the election results were not fraudulent. And on November 25th, there were 4 members of the U.S. Congress that asked the OAS to respond to very specific questions in the report of the CEPR. On December 2nd, The Guardian also published a letter signed by 98 economists and statisticians asking the OAS to retract its misleading statements about the election, which have contributed to the political conflict and served as one of the most used justifications for the military coup. So yes, I'm not in disagreement at all that there was a lot of social unrest in the country over the issue of Evo Morales running again. However, the U.S. had pre-planned what happened that caused the conditions for the coup to take place. And in fact, there is now recently an article, if I can find it in among all my papers piled up here, that U.S. aid recently, this is a January article, yes, right here, January 10th, U.S. aid arrived in Bolivia to monitor the elections, which is of particular concern to what is coming up in May. And I would like to say that as a person who was part of a delegation monitoring the elections, here's my hat and my badge, in 2014, that I left that process thinking the U.S. had a lot to learn about how to run elections. I would just like to mention a couple of points. The ballots, all paper, are color-coded by party with photographs of the presidential candidates and an area within which you can make a mark indicating your intention to vote for that candidate. The election process is completely open. There's boxes. There are many people with fingerprints. The counting process is an open process in the rooms where you can actually, anybody, and we did, all of us, as part of the international delegation, went from polling site to polling site, not just monitoring how the elections themselves were run, but watching the process of counting the votes afterwards. And each and every ballot is held up, indication if it's a mark of intention, marked in several places, and it's all tallied and signed, and it's just an incredible process. There's no work on the day of the elections. There are no cars on the streets. It's a complete process. And if you don't vote, unless you can establish a very good reason for not voting, you have to pay a fine. So the voter turnout is very high. So I just want to make those observations before we move on.
While you were talking, I looked up Bolivia. It has a
wait for the mic.
A fairly high.
Hold on.
You can't hear me? I can't.
No, it won't work on the radio.
It's being filmed for the process.
It has a fairly high GDP. Its GDP is higher than Costa Rica. The literacy rate is quite high. It seems like it's a fairly prosperous country. The largest percentage of the labor force is in the services industry. It's not just agricultural. So the question I have is, well, what is the political conflict? These are not illiterate people. And if there's a conflict on this scale, then there's got to be huge divisions among this population. Where do those divisions come from?
I mean, that's a huge question. I guess one way I would approach it is to say that there is, you know, the sort of political energy that brought Morales into power is kind of fueled by a big question of who should be included in the economy, who should be included in society. And when he took power, it was very much a reversal of a kind of neoliberal state of affairs that enriched a very small portion of the population, primarily of European descent, and sort of shattered that in a number of ways. And you know, one sort of through line in all of this throughout his presidency and now is a question of you know, who should money go to from the economy. There's big battles over, for instance, you know, whether or not revenue that comes from the tremendous natural resources that Bolivia has, most notably natural gas, but lots of sort of minerals as well. You know, where should the money that comes from those, who should it go to? You know, who deserves it? And Bolivia has you know, hundreds of years of experiencing the money derived from those resources going to a very small percentage of the population, and Morales kind of like burst that.
46, that's in the middle.
Yeah, so and Morales gets a huge, so he mentioned the fact that inequality is not terrible there, say by regional standards, and under Morales's tenure, the Gini index actually inequality reduced by 19%, which is pretty remarkable, and that's both due to an economy that was well run and also aided by the creation of a robust welfare state and modern infrastructure and so on. But I'm saying in kind of a circuitous way just basically that there's an ongoing sort of class divide and question of who deserves to benefit from the natural resources and the kind of work that people put in the Bolivian economy, and that was at least part of a big part of and of course that's entirely racialized you know, series of projects. And for a lot of the right-wingers in Bolivia who supported the coup, I think the question was the idea of like redirecting resources that had been going, you know, out of their pockets into the pockets of a lot more people than usual.
We'd also add that there was a boom of prices of the raw materials that Bolivia offers to the market. So that's another reason why there was that possibility of redistribution and inclusion of more people through bonuses and sort of like a welfare state type of policies that would benefit people in that way, giving them the money to be able so that kids stay in school, or mothers who have who are going to be women who are going to be mothers have the monetary support to go to the clinic.
In the beginning, also, what Evo Morales did when he nationalized the natural gas resources and determined that the profits should be redistributed to the population was that he radically, and very few people would disagree with this in Bolivia, that in the first years, he radically reduced poverty. The reason there's such a high literacy rate is because of his emphasis on education, women's rights. The indigenous population is 2/3 of the population of Bolivia, so it's a very big deal that the indigenous people's rights were established in the Constitution and a plurinational nation was formed. What's your name?
My name is Lucy Pagoda Quesada, and I am from Honduras.
Wow.
My heart goes out to the Bolivian people. My sister Calla, I know exactly what you're feeling. I am also a victim of U.S. imperialism in Honduras and in all of Latin America. I think that the situation of Bolivia cannot be seen in isolation. We need to look at it in the context of what has been going on in our region for the past 20 years. The United States has been at war. Our government, the one that we pay taxes, millions of dollars were mentioned before, right? That go out to the wars. Well, part of that war that the United States government has is against progressive governments in our countries. One of them was the progressive government of President Manuel Zelaya Rosales, which the United States government, under Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, destituted in 2009. And ever since, sister, we have not recuperated our peace. What you see today in the caravans, the exodus of massive people leaving my country, Honduras, along with other countries in the north, so-called North Triangle, is because of instability that our government is producing there. I didn't come to this forum to sugarcoat what is going on, because I am a direct victim of what our government of the United States is doing in our countries. And it's the same thing that is happening against the government of Venezuela. It's the same thing that the United States wants to do to the government of Nicaragua. It's the same thing that the United States has been doing for the past 50 years against the socialist government of Cuba. So let's think about it in a more broader way. Let's look at what is happening in Chile. The uprisings against neoliberalism. That's the war of the people against the system that has been imposed onto us that hasn't worked out. And that is kicking our people out, destituting them, just having them leave our countries because there's nothing there for the great majorities. What is there now is for the people like Áñez. First of all, Áñez is not a president. She is a self-proclaimed peliteñida. Nobody elected her. The people of Bolivia did not elect her. So she's not a president. Let's not call her a president because she's not. So that's the first thing, right? And then after that, we're going to talk about President Evo Morales. I'm not going to take too long, but what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at this in a larger context. What we have is a war against the people of Latin America because of U.S. imperialism, because of U.S. capitalism, because of U.S. failed neoliberalism. This is why the people of Chile are on the streets. This is why the youth of Chile, this is why the people of Ecuador are rising. Because of what's happening. So let's be honest with ourselves. And let's look at how our government is doing with our tax money. When the coup happened in Honduras, I will go there, and on the streets, the tear gas that was thrown at our people said made in the US. Right? With my tax money, I'm a teacher here for more than 20 years in this country. I pay a lot of taxes. And to know where my tax money is going to kill my people, let's be honest. Áñez is not there to protect the rights of the Bolivian people. She's there to protect the rights of imperialists and the bourgeoisie like her, who thinks she's a bourgeoisie. But really, honestly, her hair, that's indigenous hair. And she should be ashamed of herself for dyeing her hair blonde. She should be ashamed of herself. She needs to be proud like me and like my sister here with African hair, indigenous hair. That's beautiful hair, not dyed hair. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and long live the people of Latin America who resist against U.S. imperialism, against U.S. capitalism, and against U.S. neoliberalism. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on the question of the indigenous, to follow up on that, it was really striking the open contempt that was shown towards the indigenous population, the ripping off of on the military part, on their armbands. If you could talk a bit about...
I started the Observatory on Racism in Bolivia because we saw similar events when Evo Morales was elected at the beginning of in 2007. He got together with the Ombudsman, the Defensor del Pueblo, and he said, we have to say something about what's going on. And it was similar situations where indigenous women in the Constituent Assembly, and we did the research, were being followed and insulted, and just that sort of insult increased into violence. They were taken by their hair and whatever, right? Because they were indigenous and they were not supposed to be in the Constituent Assembly, right? Their place was somewhere else, not there. So we studied what was going on, and we created these processes of denunciation in the press through the Ombudsman, and then there came a time when 25th of May 2008, the Constituent Assembly was not, the draft of the Constitution was not approved yet, so that the national struggle was there between the Oriente, the eastern part of the country, which was called La Media Luna, where a rightist populist movement had been created, and the sort of progressive forces that were trying to, trying to help build a first indigenous state, right? So that's when 25th of May, people were stripped of their clothes. It was a ritual, like from the margins of the city, they were beaten up, and then little by little they brought them to this main plaza. They stripped them of their upper clothes, and they humiliated them. They made them kneel and sort of like they forced them to say that they were against the Mass Party and against Evo Morales and whatever. That triggered a whole process of social mobilization against that, and therefore an emergent social movement that was anti-racist specifically. So we got together not only with the Ombudsman, but all kinds of organizations, and forged this anti-racist movement. What happened there? And that's what I didn't talk about before. Like, we all believed that the state should back this process through legislative agendas and through public policy agendas. And that was done. But once we did that, and once at the national level, as I said before, there were these pactos, how do you say pactos? Pacts between the government and the business interests of people in the eastern lowlands, the agribusiness that I was talking about. When those pacts were being done, right before the new constitution was approved, then all our efforts were starting to be sort of like appeased. Okay, you were part of an anti-racist movement. We're gonna have within the state, within the Vice Ministry of Decolonization, an anti-racist unit, and we're going to have a comité de lucha contra el racismo y toda forma de discriminación. So we gathered there, and we believed in that. We merged our sort of movement and our interest in align with the state, because we really believed in that a legislative agenda was going to help that process, right? A public policy agenda in schools, everywhere else was going to help that process. What happened was co-opted, and nothing was achieved. do that. Yes, there is a law, there was some public policy and there was some actions in school, but mostly the status quo was more important to defend than other things. So state work around racism got paralyzed, right? And so when you saw all those things in the press, people being sort of dragged into the streets, that woman who was the mayor of Linto, right? It was outrageous, but then, I'm sorry, these are just long process. But then, when you think, right, in the 13, 14-year period, that legislative process, that public policy process should have been sort of pushed and real education, real implementation of the law would have occurred, and it didn't. So you come a situation of crisis, and this thing happens again. It's not prepared, it's the same. Feminicides have increased, and during the Evo Morales government, feminicide statistics rose up to the sky. Why hasn't the government of Evo Morales went right to the matter, right? Yeah.
There is a law.
There is a law, but no implementation, no resources for an implementation. So it's that. There's a gap in terms of implementation of policy that doesn't allow that it didn't work. And so I understand the outrageousness.
I think the one thing that is striking to me and that I've thought about is the extraordinary precarity and tentativeness of racial progress that has been made in Bolivia, and the fact that so many people I spoke to in Bolivia will talk about how their lives were transformed by him taking power. In terms, there is the symbolic element, and then there's also the legal side of things. The symbolic being, of course, the first indigenous president in the country, in a place where indigenous people have been brutally repressed and marginalized. It is just an extraordinary thing to see someone take power who really represents an exploited majority. So that was a huge thing. And then on top of that, you have the policy side of things. I've talked about the economic policies that were more inclusive, but there's also sets of laws that were meant to prevent racial discrimination, access to businesses, for example. One story I heard over and over again from people from all kinds of different backgrounds where, like, oh, I would be in a shop and an indigenous woman in a traditional Poeira skirt would say, if I were to come into here, before Morales was elected, I could have just been thrown out. If some white person said, I don't want them in here, they're filthy, they're dirty, and they could literally get kicked out. In those exact same spaces now, indigenous people are opening up their own shops and these things. And it's, that's a huge sort of difference. So, and along with these things and certain prohibitions on expressions of public racism, you create a new public culture of certain kinds of what could be called a kind of political correctness. And it's amazing that when you have a crack in this kind of system and when you have an opportunity for the right to come in, how quickly so much of that unravels. Now, all the legal and economic stuff hasn't all completely come apart yet, but the cultural side of it has shown through. We've seen a lot of vicious, just horrendous racism being expressed, and it's amazing. And there's a debate on the left about how much should we care about interpersonal racism versus institutional or systemic. And I'm often, against false dichotomies, and I think in these situations they feed off of one another. So if you have a resurgence in racism and popular culture in Bolivia, well, that'll help provide a great foundation for taking away the legal or economic rights of the majority and disenfranchising them again, right? So it's all very scary. That's the conclusion.
Just would like to say a couple of things. One is I was part of my training, and there's somebody else in this room I saw come in who was there in Bolivia with me, was in an elementary school in El Alto where I saw that the Quechua language was being taught in the schools. Quechua and Aymara are the two indigenous languages of the area. That's a big change from before Evo Morales became president. Another thing in terms of racism, not just the wifala being torn, which is the indigenous flag being torn off the uniforms of the police, but Camacho saying that Pachamama will never again enter the White House the presidential palace, excuse me, on the day that Evo Morales was forced to leave the country, and Anya's talking about satanic rights of the indigenous people. If this isn't racism, what is?
I just wanted to add that, I talked about the continuity of the extractive agenda of the Morales' government in this government, the continuity of the repressive apparatus and whatever. And I really think that in that extractivist agenda, in the during the Morales' government, and in the extractive agenda that is continuing now, there is racism.
Cuando canto soy jilguero, canto poncho sombrero. Cuando canto soy jilguero, canto poncho sombrero. Así cantando vivo feliz, yo no he nacido para sufrir. Así cantando vivo feliz, yo no he nacido para sufrir. Yo no he nacido para sufrir. Yo no he nacido para sufrir. Las mujeres del pueblo, cariñoso y sincero, con las mujeres del pueblo.